At the start of every new console generation, there's a handful of titles that are unveiled, revealing some impressive looking graphics and not much else. Past years saw Rise Son of Rome on the Xbox One and the Order 1886 on PlayStation 4, even if the latter launched 2 years after the console. Both of these titles, and many more like them, tend to launch at the full price tag of $60. When taken in context of that number, these visual showcases for what the future of their respective consoles can do are dreadful. Absolute rip-offs that nobody should ever have paid that amount for. But if taken in context of $20 or $30, then these titles have some weight behind them and are usually worth checking out, if little less than a tech demo, but more often than not, they offer a fun, if not a little uneven experience. So here comes Godfall, one of the first next-gen titles to be shown off at the PlayStation 5 reveal event. I'm not going to get started on the trailers leading up to launch because I thought they all looked awful, but on top of being yet another tech demo for a new console, that $60 price tag bloated to $70, or 125 Australian dollars. A figure that is already controversial among great games like Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart and Returnal. But it's nearly universally criticised for anything other than the triplest of AAA titles. As you could imagine, if you had seen the trailers leading up to Godfall's launch, and you're aware of how a lot of day one next-gen titles go, then you wouldn't have been surprised by the overall dud reception. Some sites said Godfall was fun enough for the 10 to 15 hours it'll take you to complete it, with little depth in its endgame and mission structure, while others said its combat was clunky and unsatisfying. Its loot was too plentiful while not offering nearly enough build customization. Almost everyone loved the distinct and bespoke Valor Plate designs, but everyone was kind of aware they did very little in terms of changing combat in any meaningful way. Having completed the campaign, the Fire and Darkness DLC, and put a few hours into the endgame, I can confidently say 90% of the reviews got Godfall completely right. I personally really enjoyed the combat. It's not perfect, like there's a few extremely obvious flaws that can frustrate the shit out of you, but taken as a whole, I had a blast hacking and slashing. Shifting ever so slightly, the loot is plentiful and a lot of it is actually surprisingly interesting. But with 90% of what you pick up being completely useless to you and the UI being unbearable to use with no functional salvage system, leads to the loot being more of a pain to sift through rather than something you get excited to dig through at the end of each mission. The visuals are unmistakably impressive, even a year after the launch of next-gen consoles. But the art direction and visual design sit on a pendulum that swings wildly between gaudy and uninspired to stylish and polished. Completely separated from the look of Godfall is the level design and mission structure that are so generic and repetitive that I struggled to comprehend how little effort was put into making this campaign interesting. And finally is the seriously forgettable and laughable story that is so bad. It's the type of paper-thin story that makes you wonder if the writers were taking the piss or if this was seriously the best they could do. I have a lot more to say about Godfall throughout this review. I'll dive into the endgame details as well as the Fire and Darkness DLC, since Godfall is a live service looter that ideally wants you grinding away for hours after you've beaten its campaign. Lastly, I'm going to dunk on a lot of systems in this review, particularly the story, the UI, the mission structure, and the balancing. But by the conclusion of this video, I'm going to recommend Godfall to you. And I'll give you my quick recommendation right now. If you have nothing to play at the moment and you like third-person action games and you can find Godfall for like $20 to $30, then I think it's worth picking up, playing for 10 to 15 hours and never touching again. When taken in context with this heavily discounted price tag, Godfall is a fun, mindless action title. If taken in context with the 125 Australian dollar price tag, Godfall is a horribly compromised experience. If you watched any of the Godfall trailers, it would have been explicitly obvious that the combat looks remarkably similar to God of War. The developers have implemented a fairly tight field of view camera system. It's a third-person action setup with light and heavy attacks. You have a shield that can be used to block and parry incoming blows. The shield's animation also involves a circular transformation, just like Kratos's. There's the Arch and Fury R3 plus L3 I win button that is near 1-for-1 of the Spartan Rage, and the list goes on. I would almost say Godfall is unapologetically God of War, but I feel like the developers have added enough new elements to make this rendition of third-person action unique, while embracing some frustrating design choices. First and foremost, Godfall uses a two primary weapon system where both weapons are as important as each other. This is achieved by the polarity system, where dealing damage with one weapon simultaneously charges your sheathed weapon. Once the polarity bar is filled, you can switch weapon on the fly, causing a shockwave of destruction to erupt under your character and buffing your damage for a short amount of time. The polarity system is but one of the 3 or 4 unique innovations to the action genre. Where a lot of other games use multiple primary weapons as a player's choice decision, they don't usually give you any reason to switch from weapon to weapon unless its DPS is higher. However, Godfall actively wants you to put equal choice and consequence on each weapon you equip. It's a subtle change to the action formula, but the polarity system essentially doubles your weapon choice, and I think that's a refreshing idea. The next unique modifier has to be the soul shatter mechanic. Aside from light attacks just dealing damage, they also build up soul damage on your target. The more light attacks you land, the bigger the soul buildup. Striking a heavy blow will detonate this buildup for a massive burst of damage. Ultimately, this mechanic changed combat more for me than the polarity system because I just loved going in and out of a scrap, spamming the light attack button and then exploding my target with a charged heavy attack. But this actually merges seamlessly with the polarity system since it encourages you to use a fast light attacking weapon and also a strong heavy weapon. Additionally, Godfall implements a posture-like system with its inclusion of the break gauge. This is a simple meter that raises when you hit your opponents, and once you've maxed it out, they'll become vulnerable, letting you perform a visceral attack, typically finishing off the remaining health on your opponent. And finally, there's additional damage types like fire, earth, and wind. All of these basically boil down to a damage over time effect, so they don't change combat all that much, but when paired with the weak spot mechanic where a well-placed attack will deal increased damage, it gives you plenty to play around with. So you've heard the few inclusions that makes Godfall's combat stand out from its contemporaries. And honestly, they do a great job of making this combat system fun. They're really doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Combining the polarity system with the soul shatter mechanic, all while focusing on hitting weak spots and building up your opponent's break gauge, leads to each fight giving you enough to focus on and keeps the combat feeling fresh and engaging for most of the runtime. The combat isn't perfect, however. There's a lot of little problems that will plague your enjoyment. The tight camera perspective is the first issue you'll notice. Just like God of War, you can barely see your feet, or enemies for that matter if they're further than 80 degrees in either direction of your character. Luckily, there's a field of view slider to play around with, but even when it's maxed out, the difference is minor. Since this is a fast-paced action slasher, you would expect animation cancelling to be an integral part of the combat. Unfortunately, it's not. This is arguably the biggest downside to combat since it makes everything feel super sluggish and janky since you're spamming the block or dodge button, but you're having to watch your character finish a lengthy animation, unable to do anything about it. Not having the ability to cancel animation really punishes weapon experiment since each weapon has unique animation timings, meaning the only way to master combat is to fully understand the time it takes you to swing your weapon so you can dodge out of the way of an incoming blow, otherwise you'll probably get staggered. Which is yet another frustrating design choice. So many enemies will constantly stagger you, forcing you to watch a 3-second animation of your character standing up. Not only is this extremely annoying, but it also interrupts combat more than anything else since you just can't do anything about it. Getting staggered wouldn't be as common if Godfall utilized input queuing, but unfortunately it does not. I can't recall how many times I was mid-animation and knew I needed to block or use a special attack, and I just wouldn't do anything since I pressed the button a few frames too early. There's a few more nagging issues like these in combat, like enemies not having good sound design, or sometimes the screen being awash with too many particle effects, or the campaign seemingly never being balanced since death is basically meaningless. But the bottom line is each of these minor problems all coalesce to create a combat system that feels disconnected. One half is really well designed with great additions to the action genre, some fun, flashy looking animations, and overall a solid foundation. But the other half has you frustrated and annoyed at how easy each of these problems are to fix. Personally, Godfall's shortcomings didn't ruin the game for me, but they certainly made putting down the controller one final time easier. When you load into Godfall, you'll immediately be greeted with the opening cutscene. It's narrated by the player character Oren, but you don't know that just yet. Firstly, you'll see Oren's brother Macros helping him up after a battle, and then smash cut to the two of you standing tall above a city filled with people. A couple seconds later, you're now fighting your brother in a field. Flash to white and the fight is over, but another second later you're fighting again atop the Godfall HQ. Macros eventually overcomes Oren, kicking him off the top of the building. Oren is presumably dead, sinking to the bottom of the ocean. However, mysteriously, Oren is alive and well and has two companions with him. You all walk into the camera and the actual game begins. Quick side note, you never actually see these two companions again, ever, in the campaign. I really don't know why they're in this opening cutscene. But anyway, if all that sounds super abrupt, rushed, and kinda messy, then you're completely right, because the entire campaign and story is like that. Which is super surprising since Godfall's story isn't anything complex. It's as threadbare and paper thin as you can get. All the writers had to do was give us a believable motive to have us chasing our brother for the entirety of the campaign, and they couldn't even nail that one basic story beat. The writing is the main culprit. It's so bad that basically every conversation is a rewritten version of the previous conversation you just had. I can't count how many times I loaded into a mission to hear Sanctum say something like, Macros has ascended and is trying to turn himself into a god, or Macros is wrong, he can't turn himself into a god, he'll die. This happens over and over and over again, and it never changes. The entire campaign is like this, by the way. You'll legitimately be scratching your head wondering if the conversations are repeating themselves, since you've almost certainly heard the information you've supposedly just learned. The writing is so awful that either the writers couldn't do anything better than this, or they thought repeating the same line of exposition tens of times in the campaign was a good idea. The next point isn't really a criticism, but I think it perfectly captures how little effort was put into the authenticity of this writing. So you play as Oren, a big brooding guy who is pretty rough around the edges. None of that is expressed through action or dialogue, but it's what the voice actor sounds like, so I'm going with that. You might have noticed that the valor plates come in two different body types, a male body type and a female body type. Well, Oren's voice actor actually changes based on the body type of the valor plate. So the male body type gets the male voice actor and the female gets you get the point. Well, when you're wearing one of the female valor plates, the NPCs still call you him during the cutscenes.
No, tell him the good news first.
Even though you're clearly not playing as the male Oren. Now, you could say that perhaps Oren is a singular character and different valor plates change their voice. I don't know, maybe it's a Darth Vader situation or something. But that also means Oren is a tiny character outside the suit of armor, since Oren can fit into both styles and one is clearly way bigger than the other. I highly doubt it. I think the developers chose to have two different voice actors and body types for inclusion. And that was 100% the right move, I applaud that. But the fact that the writing doesn't match the visual or sound of the character means they ultimately failed at what they were trying to achieve. Now, like I said, this isn't a damning assessment of the game. In reality, it's a tiny little misstep, but for me it shows how little care and attention was put into this story, these characters, and the writing. Now, I know a lot of people are going to say, well Ryan, this isn't a story-driven game, so you can't judge the story as harshly as you would with something like God of War. And I can see where people would be coming from with that statement, but the way that I see it is each mission is set up with some sort of story beat. There will be 2 unskippable cutscenes between Oren, Sanctum, and the Forge guy, and then you'll finally be transported into the mission before hearing more important information from Sanctum. The element there that confirms Godfall cares about its story is the unskippable interactions between the characters. Right there, the developers are telling you that this dialogue is important to the Godfall experience, therefore we're going to make you listen to it. And due to that, I see Godfall's story as being an essential element to the game, making it a truly terrible story that is one of the worst I've seen in a very long time. Godfall's campaign structure and mission design is woefully simple. The way it works is when you're in the hub area, you'll go to the center of the room and select a mission in one particular region. To begin with, you'll have access to the Earth region. Once you beat that, you'll enter the Water region before finally going to the Air region. Buying the DLC will unlock the Fire Zone, which is basically another reskin of the other 3 zones. So on the mission select screen, you'll be told there's a gate you need to unlock, and to do so you need 10 Earth tokens. And to get Earth tokens, you need to select a bounty hunter mission where you need to locate the target and kill it before the timer runs out. In the Earth region, you'll need to do this 3 or 4 times to get the required tokens. Once you've farmed the mini-bosses enough, you can now access the tower. Doing so will have you killing a few waves of enemies before entering the new region. The tricky part of all this is once you're in the Water and Air region, the token amount increases. Aside from needing its region's bespoke keys, you are also asked to get 10 tokens from the other zones. Meaning in the Air region, you need to go through the exact same hunting structure again for both the Earth and Water zones. Scattered throughout the Huntathon are more engaging missions that you'd expect from a campaign, but unfortunately they just boil down to going somewhere, killing a boss or pressing triangle on something, and then proceeding to the next roadblock. The mission design would be more palatable if the locations you were exploring were more interesting, but they're not. Every region is just a reskin. Aside from their colour palette, there is no distinction between the linear corridors you'll run down or the small fighting arenas. It's all very uninspired, but this is the perfect point to reflect on the price to quality argument. If I paid $100 for this, I would be so annoyed because there's just been no effort put into the campaign. But I didn't. I paid $30 so I can overlook some of the shortcomings like this. Once you've beaten the campaign, you'll be ushered toward the endgame where you'll fight increasingly difficult bosses and also try to reach as high as possible in the Ascended Tower trials. The loop here is the same as any other endgame looter. Kill enemies to get loot, so you can kill stronger enemies to get even better loot. It's all about creating that perfect min-maxing build that I truly don't understand. Aside from the loot being a mixed bag, which I'll talk about in a minute, the problem with the endgame is the same issue that plagues the campaign. It's extremely repetitive. The footage you're watching right now might not sell that this is the actual endgame, since it looks like any other part of the game. And that's because the token hunting missions are ripped straight out of the campaign and shoved into the endgame. It's the exact same structure of having you run from one end of the map to the other in search of a boss. The tower ascending trials are a bit more interesting, but you've seen this all before, with the tower you climb at the end of each biome. Once again, it's the exact same, except now it's extended to facilitate 20 ever increasingly difficult trials. It's by no means bad, but if you're already burnt out due to repetition by the time you hit the endgame, it'll do very little to change your mind. It's a bit weird that I've put off talking about loot for so long in a looter, but here we go. I think Godfall has pretty decent loot, but with a myriad of technical issues and a few bad design choices, makes the whole system more of a chore than it should be. The loot consists of 5 or 6 weapon variants, all of which can have different damage types like fire, wind, earth, and so on. Enemies will drop rings, amulets, healing stones, which change your healing capabilities, and banners that can be dropped to offer a small aura buff. There is a good amount of variety to the loot here, and with each piece having its own rarity creates a rewarding system. The most impactful piece of loot is your Valor Plate. These are the suits of armor that are laid out before you when you first enter the forge. They can be purchased at any time during your playthrough, given you have the required materials. Each Valor Plate has a unique passive and also a unique Arch and Fury ability. One has increased crit damage, while another applies water damage to any of your shield attacks, to Phoenix that applies fire damage to your polarity attacks. Now, if that all sounds like some pretty minor adjustments to you, then you would be absolutely correct. The Valor Plates do surprisingly little to differentiate themselves from one another. Honestly, 90% of the time you could be running any plate and you wouldn't notice a difference. Which kinda sucks. The visual uniqueness of each plate really should have sold their gameplay uniqueness alongside the visual changes. Besides the passive doing fuck all really, the fire or water damage build you would want to go for is not really changed via any of the Valor Plates. And with each damage affinity just being the same damage over time effect really doesn't reward any one build. It's a bit of a shame really, since the weapons you pick up can look really cool and are fun to play around with, but with the most important part of Godfall being a dud decision makes the loot pretty disappointing. Okay, to wrap this review up, let's briefly talk about the DLC. Fire and Darkness can be purchased for $15 to $30 depending on the sale. The story it tells and the missions you'll experience take place after the campaign. As the name would suggest, Fire and Darkness takes you to the Fire region, where you'll have 5 main missions to complete, a couple of hunting expeditions and another endgame mode which focuses on a new light mechanic. The levels you'll be exploring aren't amazing, but they are on the higher end of what Godfall has to offer thus far. The same goes with the visual design. It's pretty generic, but overall it's certainly not the worst looking area. As far as the bosses are concerned, Fire and Darkness doesn't do anything to change the disappointing roster. In fact, it has one of the worst bosses I've ever experienced. Earlier I said Godfall seems like it was never balanced, as playing on medium difficulty is basically a walk in the park, and while playing on hard I only died a handful of times. Well, Fire and Darkness feels like it's been way overtuned for solo players. Nowhere is this more obvious than with the final boss. The big bad of this DLC has you first going up against 3 enemies, each having their own ballooned health bar. It's not a coincidence that Godfall can be played in 3-player co-op, and the final boss having 3 clones. As a result, playing in solo makes this fight a nightmare. Overall, if you finish the base game of Godfall and feel like playing a few more hours of original-ish content, then the DLC is worth it, even if it's more of the same at the end of the day. Now, you might be wondering why I'm still recommending Godfall when so much of this review has been talking about all the shit it gets wrong. Well, like I said in the introduction to this review, you have to take everything in context of the purchase price. If a game is $10 or $100, the same problems will still persist. But when the price tag is lower, I can tolerate a lot more. In Godfall's case, I can tolerate the repetitiveness of basically everything. I can tolerate the copy and pasted mission design, I can tolerate the terrible UI or the missteps in combat. All these flaws and more still exist, no matter what price point you buy Godfall at. But personally, I enjoyed my 20 or so hours I spent hacking and slashing. And no matter what the overall reception was or is, will change that I recommend Godfall. Just as long as you can get it at a cheap price point. The DLC is super optional, but if you've finished the campaign and think you could play another 5 hours of newish content, then it's not $15 bad spent. So, in the defense of Godfall, I think it's pretty good and well worth checking out in 2022 if you enjoy this type of game.